CBS News' Nikole Killion is at the White House. CBS News political correspondent Keefe is at the Capitol. And CBSN legal contributor and former assistant U.S. attorney in New York's Eastern District, Keir Dougall, is with me on set. Welcome, all of you. Thanks for being with us. Nikole, I want to start with you. President Trump says he thinks that Special Counsel Mueller acted honorably. Has the White House seen the full report or just the summary the rest of us have seen so far?
Yeah, at this point, it's unclear. What we do know is that the president's lawyer, Emmett Flood, got a readout of that letter yesterday as the attorney general was releasing that letter to Congress. Certainly, the big question here at the White House today, of course, is whether or not the president and the White House support the full release of this report, which is something Democrats have been calling for. The president a short time ago in that media availability said that it is up to the attorney general. It wouldn't bother him at all. That is something that his press secretary, Sarah Sanders, also said as well earlier this morning.
Now, Barr said Mueller did not draw a conclusion as to whether the president's conduct examined by his team constituted obstruction. Senator Lindsey Graham spoke about that at a press conference today. Let's listen to what he said.
Lawyers are not in the exoneration business. The lawyers into making cases are not making cases business. So all I can tell you is that when it comes to obstruction of justice, Mr. Barr and Rosenstein concluded that the facts did not justify a charge. Mr. Mueller apparently could not find sufficient evidence to conclude on his own that the president obstructed justice in a classic sense. And Mr. Barr said, along with Mr. Rosenstein, having looked at the evidence, we do not believe there is evidence to support a charge of obstruction of justice. And it is important but not dispositive that the underlying crime did not exist. You can actually obstruct justice even if there's not a crime, but the intent really does go to whether or not somebody is trying to protect themselves. And if they did nothing wrong to begin with, it's pretty hard to prove obstruction of justice.
So, Keir, let's unpack some of Lindsey Graham's statements there. Let's start with what he said about lawyers are not in the exoneration business. Was that unusual that the special counsel said he could not exonerate the president in his report?
We're walking now back into this question about unindicted individuals and what's the policy, the Justice Department policy about making statements about that. The general rule, as we've said before, is that you don't do it, but there is an exception that's been on the books for a long time where if it's an issue of national public importance that you can do so. And we're certainly in that territory here. Now, Mr. Graham's comments that we just listened to, I think most of them are accurate. The bit about how lawyers are not in the exoneration business is a good soundbite. I don't think it tells us very much in particular. What is left after Mueller and Barr and Rosenstein conclude that the Justice Department does not believe that it can prove beyond a reasonable doubt that obstruction occurred, what you're left with is conduct perhaps that doesn't quite rise to that level. Wrongful conduct, improper conduct.
So is it true that what he sort of says there, that you can't obstruct justice if you're not hiding anything to begin with? Is that kind of
No, he was making
to?
I know Senator Graham is a former prosecutor, so he knows this territory well. You can indeed obstruct justice after an alleged crime. You can obstruct justice on an investigation of a crime where no underlying crime occurred. You can do that. And it is important that we have that law in the books because you send FBI agents scurrying off, you waste time and money and perhaps deflect to wrong people. But I think the point that Mr. Graham and the Attorney General are making is it's a harder case. It's a much harder case to prove obstruction if there isn't the underlying crime which would provide the motive for why the obstruction would have occurred after the fact.
Okay, gotcha there. Now, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer released a statement Sunday saying Attorney General Barr's letter raises as many questions as it answers. House Judiciary Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler says that he wants to hear from Barr.
It's imperative that the Attorney General release the full report and the underlying evidence. The entire unfiltered report as well as the evidence underlying that report, must be made available to Congress and to the American people. As much information as can be made public should be made public without delay. I intend to fight for that transparency. We will ask the Attorney General to testify before the House Judiciary Committee. We will demand the release of the full report.
So, Ed, what are Democrats looking for in the full report, and what do they want to know from the Attorney General? I mean, it certainly seems to me there are still a lot of unanswered questions, certainly surrounding that Trump Tower meeting. I mean, there are things that we should probably know from the full report.
Well, Democrats certainly believe that, and that is why they're pushing to see not only the final report, but all the raw materials that went into it, including people that they might have investigated but ultimately not charged. That'll fly in the face of Justice Department policy that says that you're not supposed to release that kind of information, especially if somebody hasn't been publicly charged. Although some Democrats turn around and say, well, look at all that business with Hillary Clinton right at the end of the 2016 campaign, all that came out. So if you could do it then, why can't you necessarily share all that information now? Based on Jerry Nadler's request for Barr to testify and comments by Lindsey Graham to us just a little while ago saying that he too wants to hear from the Attorney General, it's safe to bet now that the Attorney General will be up here at some point soon testifying to the House and Senate Judiciary Committees. But I asked Senator Graham, what about Robert Mueller? Should he come testify as well? Democrats in the House certainly want him to. Graham said that's up to the Attorney General to decide. And the reason is because Mueller is not an independent counsel. He's a special counsel reporting up to the Attorney General, who ultimately would determine whether or not one of his employees, current or former, because there's a chance that Mueller will leave before he testifies, if he ever testifies, should actually come and answer questions publicly before Congress. So question, I think, though, for Democrats isn't just when and how we're going to get our hands on this. It's how long do you really want to fight that fight, and how deeply do you want to drop into a wormhole over it if the conclusion is the president didn't collude with the Russians, and it's unclear if he obstructed justice, and what it's to say that later this week or next week some poll comes out that says the American public's ready to move on.
Right.
There's real political risk for Democrats if they dive too deeply into that. That's why we'll probably see them continue with investigations, but in much more narrow and discreet ways, into questions about administration policy, about some other decisions made by the president, the fact that his hotel still operates down the street here, has a relationship with a federal agency, and he may be violating the emoluments clause, questions about his banking, his taxes, potentially his children's relationship to the business, all of that yet to be decided, and Democrats likely to spend the next 3 or 4 days trying to suss out whether or not it makes sense to keep going.
Sure. There are, like you said, lots of other investigations going on, and Barr even pointed out there was part of the report he could not talk about because it led to another investigation. So certainly there will be much more to discuss. But the president, of course, spent the last 2 years calling this investigation a witch hunt. So, Nikole, now that we know the key findings from Mueller's report, does this give the president fuel to try to discredit other congressional investigations, or does he now like Robert Mueller again?
Well, certainly, I think, the president and the White House is giving credit to Mueller for the job that he did in completing this investigation. But look, the president just a few minutes ago once again referred to this whole thing as a witch hunt. And, clearly this is something that has riled him. I mean, just yesterday I was at Mar-a-Lago, and when he got ready to depart, you'll recall he said on the tarmac this was an illegal takedown that failed. So certainly the president has some very strong feelings about this, and certainly I think he could potentially use this to fuel, and discredit other investigations, particularly those in Congress, because as Ed pointed out, if he didn't collude and that was kind of the big fish, the big smoking gun we were looking for, then, yes, there are these other investigations, but really, what are you going to get the president on? I think certainly we'll continue to hear that line, especially, pointing the finger at Democrats. We saw as much, too, from the president's re-election campaign. Essentially it was a very strongly worded statement, calling Democrats liars. And I think, as Democrats try to bolster their case for more transparency and doing these investigations similarly, I think you'll see those on the president's side, particularly his supporters, also arguing that enough is enough.
So, Ed, I want to get back to something you said earlier. You know, Senator Graham also, as you mentioned, said that he wants as much of the report released as possible. But he also essentially called for an investigation into the investigation. So that's not moving forward, as you were alluding to earlier. What exactly is he after? And is this something that other Republicans are likely to call for as well?
He's after the justification for why a FISA warrant was given out for investigations to begin. He's looking into, or would like to look into, how it is Christopher Steele put together that so-called dossier that led to so much suspicion in the Justice Department, why Loretta Lynch felt the need to recuse herself from this whole affair once she met with Bill Clinton on the tarmac during the 2016 campaign. Basically, all those questions that have swirled, especially, frankly, among supporters of the president and conservative media and commentators. His argument being this whole thing isn't necessarily settled, at least not in the eyes of the president and his supporters, until there's a special counsel appointed by Barr to look into that, and possibly separate Senate investigations led by his Judiciary Committee. But for Republicans, some at least up here to say, let's move on, and then have Lindsey Graham leading some kind of investigation like this, that's not going to square. And that's why, at a minimum, nobody's moving on, at least not anytime soon.
Not this afternoon, for sure. Now, Nikole, do we have a sense as to whether the conclusion from Mueller could influence whether the president will consider using his pardon power on some of those individuals who've already been charged?
I think it's too early to say, and, you know, it's one of those situations where, you know, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. The president in that media veil in the Oval Office with the Israeli prime minister, you know, the president was asked at the very, very end about that, and, you know, he said that he hasn't really thought about that, hasn't really thought about pardons. Also, again, his press secretary, Sarah Sanders, said there were no discussions that she's aware of in terms of, for instance, pardoning someone like Paul Manafort, who was recently sentenced to several years in prison. So I think it's a question that will continue to be asked, but as of now, it doesn't appear that it's anything on the table at the immediate moment.
Okay, now, Keir, I want to ask you, according to reporting from our own Paula Reed, the Department of Justice knew 3 weeks ago that Robert Mueller was going to say that he did not have evidence to charge the president with obstruction of justice, but he could not exonerate him either. So they've known this for 3 weeks. What do you make of that?
Well, you know, I think we'd all like to have a little more transparency over that and how that happened and why it happened. And I think that raises a sort of a larger question. I think in the interim, assuming that there's no, big surprises, right? That we're going to need to accept this letter that the Attorney General wrote for what it says. But because these questions are so important, and the independence of this investigation is one that we need to have complete confidence in, we need as the public to see the underlying facts, the underlying information that led to these conclusions. And so, you know, the fact that Mr. Mueller did not reach a conclusion about the obstruction, but the Attorney General, who is a political appointee, did, that may be proper, but under the circumstances, I think we need to have transparency on that. So the 3-week lead for the obstruction information is in that category of questions that I think we need transparency on.
A lot of questions remain, I think, here. Thank you so much, Nikole Killion and Ed O'Keefe. Thanks to all of you. We will be checking back in with you later this hour.